60 seconds. That is roughly how long a UH-1 Huey helicopter spent on the ground at a contested landing zone in Vietnam before it needed to be back in the air. In those 60 seconds, while infantry jumped out and the aircraft sat still and exposed, the door gunner's entire job was to put enough fire into the surrounding jungle to keep enemy rifles aimed at the ground instead of at the pilots 10 feet behind him. Some crews flew 10, 11, 12 of those missions in a single day. Each landing zone was its own version of the same question. Can you keep the fire suppressed long enough to get back off the ground? The men who flew this mission had no armor plating, no bulletproof glass, thin aluminum walls that rifle rounds went through like paper. What they had was a gun, an open door, and the understanding that the moment the helicopter slowed to land, every enemy weapon in range would know exactly where they were. We're going to tell you everything about these men today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start at the beginning and then we'll move from there. Vietnam was not supposed to be a helicopter war. In the early 1960s, the helicopter was a logistics platform. It moved supplies. It carried commanders between bases. Nobody in Washington had built a military doctrine around inserting infantry into combat by air and then covering their extraction under fire. The Army had helicopter pilots. It had crew chiefs who maintained the aircraft. What it did not have, when the war began to escalate in earnest in 1964 and 1965, was a clear definition of what the man standing in the open door of a Huey with a machine gun was supposed to be called, how he was supposed to be trained, or what his job description actually meant in practice. The jungle settled the question. Dense triple canopy forest covered most of the country. There were no roads through most of the terrain where the fighting happened. Rivers cut through mountain ranges. The enemy materialized from vegetation and disappeared back into it before conventional forces could respond. The United States Army needed to put infantry into terrain that nothing else could reach, and the helicopter was the only answer. The moment helicopters started flying into hostile territory, it became immediately obvious that the aircraft and everyone aboard was exposed and defenseless on approach and extraction unless someone was shooting back. The first door gunners were improvised. Crew chiefs mounted whatever machine gun they could find in the doorway and returned fire from the helicopter because the alternative was being shot out of the sky with no response at all. It worked well enough that by 1965 it was official doctrine. Every UH-1 Huey in the combat role carried 2 door gunners, one on each side. Their weapon was the M60 machine gun, 7.62 millimeter, capable of firing 550 rounds per minute, mounted on a bungee cord system that let the gunner swing it in almost any direction. Mechanical stops kept him from shooting off his own rotor blades or sending a burst into the fuel tank directly behind his head. The open doorway was his position. The training that preceded it was, in the early years of the war, minimal by the standards of what the job actually required. Door gunners were typically trained on the M60 and on the specific procedures for their aircraft type, but the actual tactical education, how to work a door gun on a moving aircraft approaching a contested landing zone, how to read the ground below for the specific signatures of hidden fire positions, how to manage ammunition under sustained contact, was largely acquired on the job. Men who survived their first few missions began accumulating knowledge that no classroom had provided. The ones who did not survive their first few missions had not yet had the chance to acquire it. No cover, no glass, no armor plating, thin aluminum walls on the aircraft that experienced door gunners stopped trusting within the first few weeks of flying. They learned quickly that AK-47 rounds punched through helicopter aluminum without slowing down. They learned that the most dangerous fire came from directly below, small arms and heavy machine gun fire rising from the jungle as the helicopter descended, and that the best protection available was to put their body armor on the floor beneath their feet rather than on their bodies. The armor on the floor deflected upward fire. The armor on their bodies would not have helped with most of what was coming at them anyway. What they wore instead was whatever they had. Chicken plate armor over the chest if they could get it, flight gloves, helmets with visors, and the understanding, absorbed within the first few missions, that the visors and the helmets and the chicken plate were better than nothing, but not the reason they were still alive. The reason they were still alive, on the missions when they stayed alive, was speed and suppressive fire and some combination of skill and luck that none of them could fully separate into its component parts. The 1st Cavalry Division arrived in Vietnam in September 1965 as the first fully air-mobile division in American military history. Everything about the division, its doctrine, its training, its identity, was built around the helicopter. They flew their equipment into combat. Their helicopters were their mobility, their firepower delivery, their logistics chain. In November 1965, in the Ia Drang Valley in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam, the 1st Cavalry flew directly into the first major engagement between American forces and regular units of the North Vietnamese Army. Landing Zone X-Ray. 3 days of continuous fighting in a clearing surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers. The helicopter crews flew in and out of that clearing throughout the entire battle, bringing ammunition, extracting the worst of the wounded, inserting reinforcements. Every approach to the landing zone was contested. Every departure was contested. The door gunners on every helicopter that flew those missions were working from the moment the aircraft dropped below the tree line on final approach until it cleared the far edge of the clearing on the way out. Warrant Officer James Mills flew resupply missions into X-ray on the 2nd day of the battle. His aircraft took 17 hits on a single approach. His door gunners expended more than 1,000 rounds in the time it took to descend, land, offload, and lift off again. The aircraft made it back to the forward base and was judged by the maintenance crew to be flyable, which under the conditions of those 3 days meant anything that could get airborne was going back in. Mills flew 3 more missions that day. Specialist 4 Charles Kettles flew resupply missions into X-ray during those 3 days. He was not a door gunner, he was a pilot, but the men beside him in the doors were doing the same job on every approach, and he could see what they were absorbing. Years later, he said that the door gunners on those missions were the reason any of them survived long enough to deliver what they were carrying. He returned to Vietnam for a second tour and was awarded the Medal of Honor for a separate mission in 1967, in which he made multiple trips into a surrounded American position under continuous fire, extracting wounded, and then going back for the men left behind the first time. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. The statistical reality of the door gunner situation was not something the Army publicized widely, for reasons that were understandable from an institutional perspective. The non-pilot crew casualty rate in helicopter operations was significantly higher than the casualty rates for most other roles in the war. Men who flew as door gunners were being wounded and killed at a rate that, if presented straightforwardly to recruits, might have affected the Army's ability to fill those positions. What the Army had instead was a steady supply of men who volunteered because they wanted to fly, because the flight pay was meaningful, because they had been told that helicopter crews were the ones who made a difference when the infantry needed them most, because they believed they were better suited to doing something active under fire than waiting on the ground for something to happen to them. The North Vietnamese Army understood the role of the door gunner faster than some American planners did. NVA anti-aircraft doctrine by 1966 specifically prioritized killing door gunners and pilots in roughly that order. The door gunner was the more visible target on approach because he was moving, because the muzzle flash from the M60 made him identifiable from the ground, and because his suppressive fire was the primary thing keeping the landing zone from becoming completely untenable. Kill the door gunner, and the aircraft is effectively defenseless on final approach. Kill the door gunner early enough, and the pilot may abort, which meant one more resupply mission that did not reach surrounded infantry on the ground. The NVA studied helicopter operations carefully and trained their anti-aircraft crews accordingly. Door gunners knew this. It was not a classified assessment. It was information that circulated through crews the same way all useful survival information circulated in Vietnam. Man to man, unit to unit, passed along as practical intelligence that the official training had not fully prepared them for. Some of it was accurate, some of it was legend that had accumulated enough repetitions to feel like fact. All of it was listened to carefully, because the men who were ignoring that kind of information were statistically more likely to stop being available to receive any further information. The numbers that circulated among crews about survival were not official statistics. The Army did not publish tables showing how long the average door gunner lasted before being killed or wounded. What circulated instead was the informal arithmetic of men watching what happened to other men. Units that had been in the country for several months had seen enough turnover in crew positions to develop their own sense of the odds. The figure of 2 weeks passed from veteran crews to new arrivals as an approximate expectation for how long a new door gunner would survive before being hit was not a verified statistic. It was the accumulated observation of men who had watched their own replacements arrive and depart with considerable regularity. Some men beat those odds significantly. Some men did not last 2 days. The variance was high enough that individual skill and judgment mattered, and the men who survived long enough to develop real proficiency at the role became genuinely difficult to replace, because what they had accumulated could not be taught in any training environment that existed in 1966, or 1967, or 1968. The psychological texture of the role was specific in ways that are difficult to reconstruct from the outside. Door gunners spent much of their time in the air, not in contact, flying at altitude where the ground below them was too far down to be an immediate threat, watching the landscape move past and waiting for the descent that changed everything. The transition from cruise altitude to final approach was the moment the role shifted from waiting into something else entirely. Men who flew multiple tours described the moment the aircraft started down as the point where everything unnecessary left their awareness, and what remained was the gun and the door and the jungle coming up below them. Over the course of the war, more than 12,000 helicopters of all types were lost in Vietnam, either destroyed in combat or in accidents connected to combat operations. The men aboard those aircraft, when they went down, faced a range of outcomes, depending entirely on where the aircraft fell and who reached it first. Some crews were recovered quickly, some were captured, some were not recovered at all. The prospect of going down in a remote area without immediate extraction was specific and concrete for every crew member on every mission. And the door gunners were in the position that made a controlled crash landing least survivable, standing in an open doorway with no restraint system and no cover. The missions were not always extractions or insertions. Door gunners also flew on gunship variants of the Huey, where the aircraft itself was the weapon system, rolling in on enemy positions with rockets and machine gun fire in direct support of infantry on the ground. These missions required the door gunners to work in a different way, covering the aircraft during the attack run and on the breakaway from the target, but the fundamental exposure was the same. The aircraft was slow enough at attack speed that a man on the ground with a rifle and basic marksmanship could hit it. Many men on the ground had considerably better than basic marksmanship. Specialist Larry Dahl flew with the 120th Assault Helicopter Company in the Mekong Delta. He completed more than 800 combat flight hours over 2 tours. He was wounded twice, the first time seriously enough that he was evacuated for treatment and then returned to his unit because he did not want to leave the men he had been flying with. He described the work in an interview years after the war as the only job he had ever done where he felt completely certain about what he was supposed to be doing in every moment, and as the job that took him 20 years to stop dreaming about every night. Staff Sergeant Delbert Jennings was a door gunner with the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion of the 1st Cavalry Division. In May 1966, during a mission in the Ia Drang region, his aircraft came under heavy fire and the pilot was hit. Jennings moved from his gun position to the cockpit controls and kept the aircraft from crashing long enough for the co-pilot to regain control. He received the Medal of Honor for the action. When he returned to the United States after his tour, he had difficulty explaining to people what his job had been. The gap between the reality of what door gunners did and the civilian understanding of it was wide enough in 1967 that most men stopped trying to bridge it. The physical consequences of the role extended beyond the combat itself. Door gunners flew in aircraft that operated in areas of Vietnam sprayed extensively with herbicides, including Agent Orange. The flight profiles of helicopter operations in those areas meant crew members had sustained exposure to defoliant concentrations that ground troops encountered only occasionally. The health effects took years to manifest. Men who had survived the war without significant visible injury began, through the 1970s and 1980s, to receive diagnoses that their doctors connected to Agent Orange exposure. Cancers, neurological conditions, children born with defects that the Veterans Administration spent decades disputing before acknowledging the connection. The men who came back from Vietnam in those open doors came back changed. Some heard sounds that were not there. Some could not sit in a room with their back to the door. Some could drive a car for years and still feel the automatic scan of the road ahead as something closer to threat assessment than navigation. Some of them could talk about it. Most could not, at least not for a long time, and some never could. The Veterans Administration in the years after Vietnam was not well equipped to handle the specific form of what these men carried home. The treatment available was limited, and the understanding of what combat exposure at that sustained intensity did to a person was still developing. Men who should have had access to help either did not know it existed or did not believe that what they were experiencing was something a doctor could address. Many of them managed on their own for decades before the weight of it became something they could no longer carry alone. Some of them did not manage. They remember the weight of the M60 and the way the bungee cord moved when the aircraft banked. They remember the smell of the exhaust and the rotor wash and the jungle rising toward them on final approach. They remember the sound of rounds hitting the aluminum around them, which is not the sound most people who have not heard it expect. They remember specific aircraft by tail number and specific missions by what went wrong. They remember crews they flew with for months and then did not fly with anymore. They remember the specific sound of the aircraft they flew in, which was different from any other sound in the world, and how they can still hear it sometimes. They remember the weight of the gun and the way the aircraft moved beneath their feet on approach, and the exact quality of the light on the jungle canopy at altitude in the early morning before the heat built up and the haze closed in. They remember being 20 years old and doing a job that nobody had fully explained to them before they started doing it, and doing it anyway, on every flight, until their tour was over or they were not able to do it anymore. We should not forget. Was your father or grandfather a door gunner or helicopter crew member in Vietnam? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.